Jonathan Brent, Executive Director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. This is a wonderful evening of celebration of this really extraordinary archive of Naftali Herts Kon, the story behind it. We are greatly honored to have with us today Ina Landsman, who is the daughter of Naftali Herts Kon, as well as Tomasz Konciewicz, the attorney who managed with tremendous energy and dedication and commitment to find a way of getting this archive released from the Polish government. Today is also a day of commemoration and memory of the 75th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It's being commemorated all throughout Poland. It's being commemorated in Jewish communities throughout the world. And so this is a very fitting day, actually, to be thinking about the strength of character, the resistance, the dignity, the honor of the Jewish people throughout a terrible history of the 20th century that includes, of course, the Holocaust, but also the grinding, inhuman cruelty of the Stalinist regime and the aftermath of the Stalinist regime throughout Eastern Europe. It's very difficult today for many of us to talk about both of these things because we often think that by talking about Stalinist crimes, we are somehow diminishing the horror and the uniqueness of the Holocaust. But I don't think that that's the case. I think that the cruelty, inhumanity, and pure devilishness that was unleashed throughout the world in the 20th century as a whole has got to be brought to the forefront of our thinking constantly. And when we think about this horror, whether it was in Lithuania or Poland or Romania, or elsewhere in the Soviet Union, or in the gulags, what also should come to mind were the great and decent and honorable people who resisted, who fought for what was good, who fought for what was true, whether they were Russians or Poles or Romanians or Jews or Czechs or Germans. That decency of humanity is something we can never let go of and understand. And we're living today in times when that decency is being tested yet again throughout Europe and in America itself. So this is a most meaningful event. And we are extremely grateful to all of you who are here, to our distinguished guests, to the memory of Naftali Herts Kon, who was one of those fighters, a genius, an inspired and decent and honorable voice. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Lyudmila Sholokhova, who is director of the YIVO Archives and Library, and Fruma Moore, who is the genius of these Ruth Gay Seminars, and together they will introduce the rest of the program. Thank you very much.
So the very first thing I'd like to say is everybody please close your cell phones right now, if you haven't done it, because this program is being videotaped and we don't want the phones ringing or buzzing or whistling during the presentation. So thank you very much. I will just wait a moment for everyone to close their phones. Thank you. That's my point. My name is Fruma Moorer. I'm Senior Archivist at the YIVO Institute, and Dr. Mila Sholochova, Director of the YIVO Library and Archives, and I would like to welcome everybody this evening attending the Ruth Gay Seminar in Jewish Studies. We are privileged to have with us our distinguished presenters, Ina Landsman, daughter of the Yiddish writer Naftali Herts Kon, and Professor Tomasz Kontsevich, who will both speak on tonight's topic, the reclamation of the papers of Naftali Herts Kon. The Ruth Gay Seminar is given 3 times a year, thanks to a major gift given to YIVO in 2008 by the family of Ruth Gay, a well-known American Jewish writer, historian, and scholar who passed away in 2006. Scholars who have used the holdings of the YIVO Archives and Library are invited to share their findings with the public as well as with the scholarly community. Attending tonight's events are professors, students, and members of the general public from the tri-state area. We welcome you all and hope that you will enjoy tonight's program.
I would like to express my deep appreciation to the family of Ruth Gay and to those members of the family in the audience tonight, among them Shirley Gorenstein and Margaret Gorenstein. Please join me in expressing the thanks to the family of Ruth Gay for their generous support of the archival seminar. I would like to thank the following individuals who have made this program possible. Dr. Jonathan Brandt for his ongoing enthusiastic support of the Ruth Gay seminars, Fruma Moorer for originating the programs several years ago and for continuing to organize the seminars, Alex Weiser, Director of Public Programs, for taking care of all details of the program arrangements, Olivia Reid, Program Assistant for all her hard work for the evenings tonight, Stephanie Halper, an Assistant Director in the Archives for general help and assistance with the logistics of the seminars, Ete Goldwasser, Administrative Coordinator of the Ruth Gay Seminars, whose continuous dedication to the seminar's mission has ensured the program's success over the years. And Melissa Minaya and Natalia Frankel, the staff of the Center for Jewish History and the staff of the Center for Jewish History Visual Department, and staffs and the volunteers of the Evo Institute and the Center for Jewish History. Tonight's program, the reclamation of the papers of Naftali Herts Kon, parallels to some degree to YIVO's own history. The entire archives and the library of the YIVO Institute were pillaged and confiscated by the occupying German army and by the Nazi unit called the Einsatzstab Rosenberg. During the period of the war and even after the war, the leaders of the YIVO Institute expressed their deepest concern regarding the survival of the extraordinary collections which YIVO assembled in Vilna before World War II. Max Weinreich, one of the leading founders of YIVO, who relocated to New York and re-established YIVO branch in New York as a YIVO new headquarters, spent years inquiring about the fate of the priceless YIVO collections. At present, under the Edward Blank Vilna Collections Project, YIVO is working on the 7-year project aimed at digitizing the entire content of the YIVO pre-war materials now located on different continents in Lithuania and in the United States. When we listen to Ina Landsman and Tomasz Kontsevich today, we will all see, and I hope you will see, those parallels between the fate of the YIVO own collection and the papers of Naftali Herts Kon.
The Naftali Herts Kon papers were generously donated to YIVO by Ina Landsman and her sister Vita Cerf. The collection is now being processed by YIVO archivist Beata Kajiaj, who is here with us today in the audience. These papers have a special value and a special place in the YIVO Archives. YIVO holds correspondence with and documents relating to Yiddish writers in the Soviet Union of the 1920s and 30s, as well as archival records of the Institute for Yiddish Proletarian Culture, which was a big center of study of Yiddish literature and the Yiddish language. The YIVO Archives includes correspondence of David Bergelson, Nachum Stiff, Chaim Grada's notes and poems written while in the Soviet Union during World War II, theatrical materials of the Yiddish theater in the Soviet Union, and the artwork of Solomon Yudovin, many whose etchings, while influenced by the Ansky expedition of 1911 to 1914, were created during the Soviet period.
Among all these materials on the Soviet Yiddish culture, the papers of Naftali Herts Kon hold a unique place, not only because of the unusual drama surrounding the survival of these papers, but also because of the unusually harsh circumstances to which the writer Naftali Herts Kon was subjected, both in Russia and later in Poland. As we study the papers while they are being processed at YIVO, the unique life and literary significance of this Yiddish writer and poet is finally coming to life. At YIVO, we are honored to be part of this process and honored to be hosting tonight's program.
Before inviting the speakers to the lectern, we would like to introduce them, and then I'll just give a very brief outline of the rest of the schedule for tonight's program. Ina, who insisted on giving us a very brief bio, and she really has a much longer one. Ina Landsman is a graduate of Warsaw University, Poland, and she holds an MS, Master of Science degree in chemistry. Currently retired, she had enjoyed a long career in the medical field and is now writing a biography of Naftali Herts Kon. Tomasz Konchevich is the 2017-2018 Lapa Crane Fellow, Program in Law and Public Policy, Princeton University, and Professor of Law and Director of the Department of European and Comparative Law at the Faculty of Law and Administration, University of Gdańsk, specializes in strategic litigation before supranational and the constitutional courts, and has pleaded test cases, among others, on transnational justice, judicial independence, property restitution, right to court, right to privacy and family life, freedom of expression, non-retroactivity of the law, presumption of innocence, registered partnerships, and detention incommunicado. Professor Konchevich writes extensively on constitutional law, constitutionalism, European Union law, human rights, the role of courts in the process of European integration and procedural law, and he has authored more than 200 papers and 9 books. Most recently, Law with a Human Face, published in 2015. His extensive experience in European law includes serving as the référendaire at the Court of the European Union in Luxembourg and as the legal advisor to the Office of the Polish Constitutional Court. Recently, he was a Fulbright visiting professor at University of California, Berkeley School of Law, where he co-taught comparative constitutional law, and in 2017, visiting professor at the Radziner Law School at the Interdisciplinary Center Herzliya, Israel. Professor Konchevich received law degrees from the University of Wrocław and Edinburgh, and is also a graduate of the Academy of European Law in Florence and the Europäische Rechtsakademie in Trier. His project while at the LAPA at Princeton is entitled The Politics of Resentment, European Disintegration and Constitutional Capture, Rethinking the European Overlapping Consensus, ? Before inviting Ina to the lectern, I'd just like to inform you that following the program, there'll be a small reception, which is just outside this room for your enjoyment. Before leaving the room, you will be given a handout that was prepared by Professor Konchevich that describes his experiences relating to this topic, which I think you'll find very interesting. Now, please welcome Ina Landsman.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank Ruth Gay, who sponsors this, whose legacy sponsored this seminar, and her family. I'd like to thank Jonathan Brandt and Mila and Fruma. Their welcome and their interest in my father's papers was an amazing thing for me. And at every step, there is such a championship of the papers and of the work that is being done on the papers. I also would like to thank Beata, who is working on the papers. I could not think of anyone better to do what she is doing and the way she is doing it. And also I would like to thank a very old friend of mine who is here today, Marc Webb, who for years was after me to think of writing my father's biography. Marc Webb is an YIVO almost alumni, but not yet. Certainly this is, even though when I started pursuing the papers, my quest for the papers, I did not think of writing biography. Yet I think Marc's urging me somehow was responsible for it, even though it wasn't so obvious to me at the time. But I think that that's what it is. So thank you, Marc. And of course, my biggest thanks are to Tomasz, but I will, it's part of my presentation. So can you see me, can you hear me in the back? In the back there? Okay. So by way of introduction, here is one of Stalin's favorite anecdotes. A Chekist, a secret policeman, brags about a professor who chided him for not knowing who wrote Eugene Onegin. A spoiler, Pushkin. So I arrested him. Once in my hands, he admitted it. He was the one who wrote it. So Stalin allegedly loved to entertain his guests with the story. What a testimony to his success in making writers an endangered species. My father, the Yiddish poet, writer, and journalist Naftali Herts Kon, had the bad luck of living under two communist regimes, the Soviet and post-war Poland. He was born in 1910 in the shtetl of Storozheniec in Bukovina, the eastern borderland of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. After World War I, Bukovina became part of Romania. Then the Soviets annexed it after World War II, and now it is part of Ukraine. In his mid-teens, my father moved to the nearby city of Czernowitz, now Chernivtsi, known for the rich cultural legacy of its sizable interwar Jewish population. and it was there that my father launched his career as a poet. Czernowitzer Blätter, Czernowitz's Pages, was one of the papers in which his early poems were published. In 1930, he moves to Warsaw, the Yiddish writer's Mecca, where he's recognized as a talented young poet to watch. His poems appear in a number of publications, including the prestigious and politically neutral periodical Literarische Blätter, and also in New York papers. In 1932, he joins a group of writers associated with the Literarische Tribune, an organ of the then illegal Communist Party. In the fall of that year, he arrives in the Soviet Union as a political immigrant. He's one of thousands from around the world drawn to its bold experiment to remake the world, to build a new socialist society. He's neither a Communist Party member nor a fellow traveler. He's just a 22-year-old, wide-eyed enthusiast. Soon his Warsaw fiancée, Lisa Goldman, joins him in Kharkiv, the capital of the Ukrainian Socialist Republic at the time. Their disillusionment is not long in coming. 2 years on, they realize that they are trapped. There is no way out. At the same time, things in Europe are also unsettling, given the spread of fascism and economic depression. They manage to hang on. My father's poetry collection, Trot nach Trot, Step After Step, is published in 1935 in Minsk, and his work appears in Yiddish publications in Minsk, Kharkiv, Kiev, and Moscow. My mother works in a library and studies for entrance exams to the Kharkiv Medical School. In 1936, my sister Vita is born. Now here, that's my parents. So about the time of the beginning of disillusionment. During Stalin's Great Terror, political immigrants are among the countless targeted groups. And in 1938, my father is arrested. In the Kharkiv prison, number 5, under torture, he writes a confession, which he later retracts. He's sentenced to 3 years and is sent to a corrective, aka a slave labor camp of the Gulag system. I think I missed one picture. Here, I'm sorry. So this is my father was a member of the Union of Soviet Writers, and this is a Jewish group of the members of the Union of Soviet Writers, and they had their own conference in 1934, and some of you may recognize my father there. Okay, so this is a picture taken in 1937. This is when already the Great Terror starts, and you see the difference in the expression. This is a sort of expression of a hunted or hounded man. It's he is expecting any day to be arrested. It's a huge difference between a kind of a bright expression before and this one. Stalin's next wave of purges is unleashed in 1948 as an orchestrated outrage against the ruthless cosmopolitans, a euphemism for Jews. This time, my father is a member of the principal target group, not just one of many, as in 1938. He is a regular contributor to the Moscow Yiddish paper, Inaugurated, Unity, the organ of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. A year later, in 1949, Jewish institutions, including Inaugurated, are closed down, and sweeping arrests follow. Yiddish writers and Jewish cultural elites are on the front lines of the assault. By March of that year, when my father is arrested, the official Soviet Jewish world is no more. And this is the shot in the a mug shot in the prison. So usually it's done the day they're brought into the prison and immediately taken pictures. So, okay. My father is arrested in, of the 15 arrested committee leaders, 14 would be executed in the basement of the Moscow Lubyanka prison. 5 of them were writers, all were for years part of my father's life. Some of the others, arrested Yiddish writers, would not survive the subhuman conditions in the camps. My father is arrested in Chernivtsi, where we settled after the war, and he is immediately transported to Kiev to the main NKVD prison. Beaten and tortured, he doesn't pen a confession and doesn't sign any authored by the investigators. During his interrogations, he's presented with deposition by the arrested writers who were not able to withstand torture and named him as one of their accomplices. My father's death sentence is commuted to 25 years in the gulags. In 1956, 3 years after Stalin's death, he is rehabilitated. Having served 7 years, he is pronounced innocent. On his return home, he writes a 27-stanza elegy to his martyred fellow writers. He would publish it years later in Israel in the literary periodical Die Goldene Kate. Your Halkan Jubilee is a powerful, moving work that should and must be made available to people, its editor, Avram Sutzkever, wrote. That's his letter. The poem would be included in the Great Yiddish Writers of the 20th Century anthology published in London in 1969. With no due process of law, sentencing was carried out in overcrowded prisons by the special extrajudicial troikas, each churning out dozens of convictions daily. Miraculously, my father survived the total of 11 life-defying years in prisons and gulags, but his papers, confiscated at each arrest, did not. The infamous Lubyanka prison in Moscow holds a huge trove of files on hundreds of persecuted writers. Russian writer Vitaly Shantalinsky was the first to gain access to them during perestroika. He would spend years studying them and writing about them. He chillingly dubbed these archives the KGB's literary archives, and it is the title of one of his books. Of the writers processed in the Lubyanka, 1,500 were either executed or perished while serving their sentences. Files of thousands more persecuted writers are in the KGB archives all over the former Soviet Union. On Shantalinsky's first visit to the Lubyanka library archives, the sight of the files stamped highly confidential for permanent retention, made his heart race. He believed he was about to come face to face with God knows how many treasures of Russian literature, confiscated during their authors' arrests and locked up for decades. But as he went through one bulky file after another, he was crushed by the realization that, with a few exceptions, there was barely a trace of the writer's works inside them. It turned out they had been incinerated by the KGB, which was the standard procedure. A slew of absurd crimes was imputed to the writers: anti-Soviet attitudes and propaganda, spying for a foreign power, sentiments of a terrorist nature, association with suspected spies, association with counter-revolutionary organizations. This is a group of Yiddish writers. The picture was taken in Chernovtsi right before the anti-Semitic campaign. I think, I'm not sure, they are already feeling that something is coming. And the poet in front of my father is Josef Kerler. He is a visitor from Moscow. And on the occasion of the visit, the group got together to have the picture taken. And 2 years later, they will be all arrested. So they all survived. Kerler and Haratz, next door to my dad, actually made it to Israel and finished their days in Eretz Israel. In 1959, thanks to my mother's pre-war Polish citizenship, we were allowed to repatriate to Poland. 1.5 years later, my father was arrested at our Warsaw apartment on charges of spying for Israel. All his papers were hauled away. The spying charges were dropped 6 months later for lack of evidence and replaced with charges of anti-communist propaganda. This was the time of the post-Stalin thaw, and Poland was keen on being seen in the West as breaking ahead of the communist bloc in liberalization. Due process of law was back, yet still skewed in favor of the state. With 2 attorneys representing my father, he was sentenced to 1 year. Considered a mild punishment, it was seen as a concession to the West, where newspapers' headlines and diplomats' inquiries demanded to know what happened in Poland to the Yiddish poet Naftali Herts Kon. Of his confiscated papers, around 400 pages were retained as material evidence. 2 motions by the attorneys for their return were denied. In the summer of 1964, my family immigrated to Israel, and my father left his papers behind in the hands of his jailers. All along, my father had maintained that the Polish calamity had the KGB imprint all over it. They had second thoughts, he believed, about allowing him to leave the Soviet Union. One summer day in 2010, in the reading room at the Institute for National Memory in Warsaw, I experienced emotions similar to those of Szentaliński at the Lubyanka's Literary Archives. When the stacks of scans of 2,000 pages of my father's investigation file were brought to my table, my excitement was hard to contain. The sheer size of the file suggested that the scans of those never-returned papers would be there also. I soon realized that it wasn't so. A feeling of dread washed over me. Had the papers suffered the same fate as his papers in the Soviet Union? In my excitement over the possibility of finding my father's papers in the investigation file, I failed to prepare myself for the grimness of its contents and their emotional toll on me. There was, however, wonderfully unexpected news, the Institute would provide me with a copy of the file on a CD. Just as my father had suspected, the investigation file confirmed that his arrest was the handiwork of the KGB. A few months after our arrival in Poland, it had sent an emissary, an agent provocateur, who, as far as my parents were concerned, had stellar credentials. He inserted himself into our midst, supervised at every step by his KGB handler. He unraveled a conspiracy as ridiculous as it was implausible. My father, along with the Israeli consulate staff in Warsaw, was smuggling Jews out of the Soviet Union. Writers as spies were a Soviet invention, a handy one because it was so preposterous. The motto of the organs of repression was the more absurd, the more believable. In 1938, my father was charged with spying for Poland, and in 1949, he became an American spy. To the writers in the communist states, the state's seizure of their papers was an act of extraordinary violence. Their works were not only their most hallowed possessions, they were literally part of their souls. For my father, the heartache over the loss of his papers and the rage over the savagery of their seizure had never waned. In the Warsaw prison, my father wrote, "The contents of my manuscripts reside in my head, and they're no one's business. No one has the right to touch my manuscripts without my permission, let alone use them to accuse and convict me. Do they think they can trample on my soul and run roughshod over it? Who gave them that right?" In his book, The KGB Literary Archives, Shantalinsky offers a glimpse of writers' reactions to their works being snatched from them at the time of their extreme vulnerability. Their sentiments, just like those expressed by my father, are heartrending and likely speak for every writer in a similar predicament. After his arrest, the poet Nikolai Kluyev wrote, "The fate of my poem, Hymn to the Great Mother, is like a knife pierced through my heart. I worked on it for 6 years, collected Russian mysteries, kernel by kernel, unbearable sorrow." He was one of the unique voices of the silver age of Russian poetry and was executed at age 53. Isaac Babel, world-renowned master of short stories, sent a desperate plea with the full knowledge of its futility to Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's head of the secret police responsible for millions of executions. "I ask you, citizen People's Commissar," Babel wrote, "to allow me to organize my manuscript taken from me. They're a product of 8 years of work." Babel was executed in January 1940. He was 46, and according to the official sources, his entire archive went up in smoke. Russian Orthodox clergyman Pavel Florensky, a polymath, hailed as the Russian Leonardo da Vinci, wrote in a letter from exile, "The destruction of the results of my life's work is much worse for me than my own death." He was executed at age 56. Ever since I read Shantalinsky, I couldn't stop thinking of my father's KGB files. I was able to establish that they were in the Chernivtsi branch of the Ukrainian State Archives. However, soon after Shantalinsky's discovery of the Lubyanka's literary archives, access to similar archives in the former Soviet Union had become increasingly difficult. I was extremely lucky to have the help of Vadim Altskan at the Holocaust Museum in Washington in obtaining digital copies of both files. They are the most significant documents I've managed to collect for my work on my father's biography, and my gratitude to Vadim is boundless. Unfortunately, he was not able to be here today. My father's 3 investigation files make for devastating reading, and it doesn't get less so upon rereading. I see my father as I remember him at different times when he was home, and I can't quite place him in that hell. He sublimated those 11 years by pouring his wounds and pain into his poems. Beyond that, I have not as yet found in his papers a record of his serving time. So how did he manage day after day for 11 years? How did he survive? Perhaps it wasn't possible for him to describe it. Perhaps he needed more distance from it. But he didn't live long enough to accrue the necessary healing. This short poem by my father may hold a clue. Who in concert with life gave us passion? Who helped its fires stoke? Who coaxed and urged to protect life no matter the toll? Isn't this a devil's lie, his covert design? He gave the man the rock to bend his back and make him a slave. There are, however, a couple of curious paragraphs about my father as a prisoner. Written in a tongue-in-cheek article by a former inmate of the Kiev prison, whose time there overlapped with my father's. In the cells near mine, he wrote, there were 3 Yiddish writers, Kipnis, Spivak, and Naftali Herts Kon. Humorous stories about Kon made rounds of the Soviet prisons. In the Kiev prison, he spent most of his time in the punishment cell. Once he said to an exceptionally nasty female guard, "Citizen boss, buy yourself a rooster." "What for?" "To screw him instead of me." So it earned Kon 7 days in the punishment cell. One day, during a walk in the prison courtyard, he sent his shoe flying over the wall into an adjacent courtyard. Another 7 days in the punishment cell. Every time a procurator did rounds in the cells, Kon ended up with the 7 days in the punishment cell. He was one of the very few who risked complaining to the procurator about prison rations and conditions. I recognize in that description my father's predilection for pranks, often as digs at unearned authority. But what an unlikely place to indulge it and pay for it with additional suffering. In the Warsaw prison, he wrote in pencil a series of songs for submission to the annual Polish Songwriters competition. The prison most certainly didn't post them, but it surely must have caused quite a consternation. Songs in Yiddish by a political prisoner for the Communist Songfest. Was that also a prank? Was it one of his ways of holding on in defiance to what he had been? In addition, of course, to the most potent one, that of continuing to write poems, even if only in his head, and even when in a punishment cell. On my last day at the Institute for National Memory, a reading room staff member suggested that I inquire about my father's papers at the court that had sentenced him. It sounded like a reliable tip, and at that moment I knew I would have to engage a Polish attorney. I met him by pure serendipity 2 months later when Thomas turned up at a party at my house. a young attorney. He was a house guest at one of my friends. My sister Vita, an Israeli, was visiting me at the time, and we both instantly felt that Tomasz was our man for the job, and we were right. Well, I just want to show more pictures, a few more pictures. So this is, I still don't know why, but partly a lot of writers in the Soviet Union did that. They cut the sheets of paper in half. My idea, I suspect that it's easier to hide. That's why it was done. So among my father's papers, there are a lot of bundles like this, the manuscripts like that, and you see how that these are pretty old. So here we are. Taking the possession of the papers at the archives, Warsaw State Archives. And it was a very, very difficult, a very emotional moment. Here we are a little happier. It's all over. We are in the front of the building, and the papers are in the carryover. We are actually heading for a celebration. So this is just a selected bibliography of articles about my dad. And this is my father's collection of poems. This is the second edition. The first edition was published in 1966 in Israel, very soon after he arrived there. There was some editorial lapses. So this year, my sister Vita decided to reissue this book of poems, and it just came out. She had a fantastic editor, very well-known Yiddishist, Eliezer Niborski, who did a wonderful job. And so the book was supposed to arrive before this event, but it's still somewhere in the mail. I'm very proud of, I'm very happy it was Vita's project. This is a fantastic project, and we will be distributing it among the libraries and few special people. Okay, Tomek, it's your next. Thank you.
Do I need to use microphone? Yeah? Okay, so it was not just a celebration in Warsaw. We were going to the best pierogies restaurant in Warsaw. And I remember until this very, very moment that we had a very, very good time. Too good to be true, almost. Yeah. So, why is this case so important for me? There are at least few dimensions of importance. First of all, symbolic. Ina has mentioned that I was visiting my mom's best childhood friend in New Jersey when my mom's friend was invited to the send-off party for Vita, and I was invited as well. And we talked at the party, and she asked me whether I would be willing to take on the case. I mean, there was no case at the time because there were no papers. We didn't know what happened. There was 60 years of silence. So first challenge was to just locate and try to find out whether they have survived. Then there is normative level of importance for me. How can I teach my students about the rule of law, human dignity, if I cannot win a case like this? That is a pretty straightforward legal case. Something has been taken from you, It doesn't belong to the state. It is in the archives. It should be returned to the owners. I mean, it's a simple case. And finally, personal reason. Just months before I met Ina, my grandmother has passed away, and she was a very special person in my life. I spent many years with her when I was studying in Wrocław. And just before the final decision by the Supreme Court of Poland in June 2014, my grandmother was recognized as the righteous among the nations of the world by Yad Vashem. So I looked at this case when I met Ina and Vita, that actually that would be something I could do to honor the memory of my grandmother, because all the lessons she taught me were deeply ingrained in my heart. Go against the mainstream truths. Do not take no for an answer. Try to be kind to people. Help out. Never turn around when injustice happens. So this was a test case, and trust me, this was a test case in its fullest sense. So first of all, what were the moments? Meeting, you know about the meeting. Searching and anxiety. What happened to the papers in 1962 when the courts have refused to return the papers to Naftali Herts Kon's family? So, tracing down the poetry was the first challenge facing me. I wrote a letter to the regional court in Warsaw that sentenced Naftali Herts Kon in the 60s. And the president of the of the regional court told me that the court files have been transferred to the archives of the city of Warsaw in Milanówek, and I should contact the archives there and ask what happened to the poems, letters, notes that supposedly were part of the court files. I did that. I traced down the poetry. I found files in Milanówek, and I remember to this very moment when I asked about the court files. The archivist who was there didn't even know that they had those files in their possession, which is really striking because afterwards one of the main arguments of the archives was that, Professor Koncewicz, we cannot return those files because they are part of the Polish legal heritage. So until 2010, they never knew about their existence, and all of a sudden, after 2010, they are like Pan Tadeusz by Mickiewicz. We will never return. But that was only the beginning, because fighting with the archives was the biggest challenge in this case. Because why? So I kept sending letters, I kept calling them, and there was nothing. So I understood that they were trying to play the waiting game with me, hoping that I would just give up and never show up. There was silence, so I filed the motion with the regional court in Warsaw for the return of the property. And in my motion, I wrote this. So I translated some of the most important parts of my pleadings. By the way, more than 2,000 pages of pleadings, 5 years of being pushed from one court to another. So I was really walking down the memory line over the last 1 week. So I wrote this: the Communist Court's decision to retain Kon's papers was a breach of its own forfeiture laws, and therefore had no legal consequence on the papers' ownership status. The archives are holding the papers it doesn't own. It must honor the legal owners' wish to reclaim them. This is an opportunity to redress the wrongs of the communist regime in the spirit of Poland's democracy, founded on the rule of law and respect for human rights. How idealistic, Mr. Koncewicz. The case comes up for the decision at the regional court in Warsaw, and this is hitting the wall first. Because the judge denies my claim and writes this. And it got really dangerous because of what he wrote and how he wrote. Naftali Herts Kon was found guilty because at the end of 1960 in Warsaw, he sent his brother in Israel an article titled Socialist plus Siguranza, containing false facts that could have potentially caused harm to Poland. and he was trying to talk his brother into publishing the article in the foreign press. The sentencing court's decision to retain Kon's confiscated papers was squarely within the parameters of the law and cannot be reversed. Wow, I was absolutely shocked by the tenor of this argument. I suspected that the judge didn't even read my motion. Polish democracy, rule of law, justice, those were terms alien to the judge, and he was my age. So I could have expected that he would at least listen to my arguments. So I filed an appeal. And in the appeal to the Court of Appeal in Warsaw, I wrote this. The daughters of the man whose life had been destroyed by the regime were denied elementary justice by the Warsaw Regional Court's refusal to return their father's writings, the fruit of his creative endeavors, and the meaning of his life. Only their immediate return, after nearly 50 years of illegal seizure, can restore justice and lend substance to the constitutional right to property. Okay, for the first time in the Court of Appeal, I heard from the archives, because archives sent a pleading to the court explaining their position. Because so far, I have never had any opportunity to talk to somebody from the archives because there was silence. And they wrote this. His family is justified in expecting some form of redress. Nevertheless, the originals must be viewed as a permanent part of the archival collections of the state. So, hope at the end of the tunnel? Yes. The Court of Appeal in Warsaw said that the ownership of the papers has never been taken away from the family. So we won on this point. But the court said it is not up to criminal courts to decide the case, it is up to the administrative courts because the archives are part of the state organs. And I have to direct my motions to the Minister of Culture and to the director of the archives in Warsaw. And this is where the most harrowing part of my fight started. Because I was not only ridiculed by the director of the archives, not only I was treated as persona non grata, but in one of the pleadings, the director wrote me this. It is with great regret that I have learned about your smearing campaign addressed at the state archives, and in particular about your accusations of the alleged illegal, arbitrary, and instrumental actions taken by the said archives. This kind of rhetoric is clearly missing in the factual, and indeed you could be, listen now, brought to justice for slandering the good name of the state archives. Suddenly, it won't work as a means to pressure state organs into actions that you desire. So that was letters, persona non grata, and then hitting the wall and discouragement. Yes, I was discouraged. At that moment, I was close to quitting. So I was really thinking, well, maybe that's a struggle that cannot be won. And then I reminded myself of my grandmother. She never quit in the darkest of times. So why should I quit in a case like this when some uneducated director of archives keeps writing emails, keeps telling me things that are clearly untrue and that are clearly illegal. So no, that's a challenge to keep coming back. Keep going after this guy until he returns what's ours and not what his. So the discouragement gave in, and I attacked the case with yet even more resolve. And I realized, sitting on the plane flying to my parents for Easter in 2013, that the key to the case lies with criminal courts after all, because they have sentenced Naftali Herts Kon. They have refused to return his writings. So this time I was much smarter. Instead of going to the regional court in Warsaw, I applied to the Supreme Court that upheld the conviction of Naftali Herts Kon in '63, and I claimed, hey, this is something that you haven't done in the past, so you have a chance to rectify the omissions by your fellow judges in '63, and the judges in the Supreme Court listened. They didn't agree that they are competent to hear this case, but they sent the case back to the regional court yet again in Warsaw, but my position was much stronger that time, because I was coming with a precedent and showing the judge, listen, this time it is the Supreme Court that tells you, have a look at the case. Don't give this guy a short shrift. And trust me, when they saw me in the regional court after 3 years again, wow, I saw in the judge's eye, wow, this guy is coming back again after three years. So yes, for the first time in 3 years, somebody listened to my arguments. Rule of law means something after all. Right to property stands for something. So we were given what's ours, but the case was not finished yet. Because Naftali Herts Kon was still a convict in the eyes of the law. He was still, the sentencing of Naftali Herts Kon was still valid. He was a guilty man that was found guilty by the courts of the Polish communist regime, and I knew that something had to be done on the symbolic level. We got what we wanted, and I might have as well said, that's it. We are happy, we got what we wanted. But what about symbolic justice? What about giving face back to the man who has been forgotten for over 60 years? And I took the case to Ombudsman, and after 2 years of delving into the case, Ombudsman brought the case before the Supreme Court on my behalf, and the Supreme Court acquitted Naftali Herts Kon and said this in June 2014. And I remember this very day because after the Supreme Court's decision, I called Ina at once, and I was on the verge of breaking down because then I felt like, oh my gosh, I saw all those years just in front of me, all those years of disappointment, of being pushed from court to court, and all of a sudden I'm sitting in front of the Supreme Court and reading this. Naftali Herts Kon's opinions and poetry presented no danger whatsoever to the interests of the Polish state. Our judges, professional and personal experience allow us to conclude that the interpretation by the Supreme Court in 1963 of the law then in force did not pass muster of just and fair application of law. Rather, it served as an example of subordinating the law to the momentary political objectives, in particular that of suppressing any critique and dissatisfaction with the political system then in force. As a result, there was no legal basis for finding that Naftali Herts Kon committed the crimes he was found guilty of. So those were the moments. So now the question is, and I keep asking this question over and over again, what kind of lessons we can learn from this case? So going beyond the case as a boat and trying to focus on the case as a journey. And I think there are very, very important lessons that explain where Polish rule of law is, what kind of changes must be made to the judiciary. First of all, I was operating in the world of fairy tales. Polish judges, as Eastern European judges for that matter, they do believe that they have to apply law, and if a law has a lacuna, it is up to the parliament to remedy the situation. It is not for the judges to second-guess the will of the parliament, because they think that the law is perfect, and their duty is to mechanically interpret the law as laid down in the statutes. And that's something that I was fighting against for 4 years, trying to tell the judges, listen, the statute is only a beginning of your journey. You as a judge have to decide the case in accordance with the principles of justice, in accordance with the new Polish constitution that says that the right to property is a constitutional right. Didn't work. I was looked as somebody who's trying to bring down the comfortable status quo. So, one of my favorite judges of the former judges of the European Court of Justice said that activism means something fundamental different depending on whether one puts oneself in the position of the strong or the weak. What is described by one as activism is seen by another as a just and necessary safeguard. And my argument was just this. I don't want the judge to be an activist judge. I want the judge to decide the case in a just manner and to deliver justice to those who come to the courtroom. Because that's, after all, is what the judges are for. If I want to read a statute and know that there is a lacuna, I can sit in my house in the kitchen and look at the statute. Oh wow, there is a lacuna. But I need a judge to help me with making sure that the statute will be interpreted, will be given a just interpretation. That's what judges are for. And this is where I had some very tough times explaining to the judges that they should be doing that, just that. So, proportionality. Proportionality was a wonderful keyword that I've been using in the case that was completely misunderstood. Think for a second. The archives have offered to return the copies, but they wanted to keep the originals. I said, no, that's not how the rule of law works. You should ask Ina for her consent that you might keep the copies, but we must be getting the originals, because this is how right to property works in a democracy and in a state ruled by law. Proportionality was never taken seriously. Lesson number 2. Constitution as the supreme law of the land here and now, forget it. Not even once the Constitution of the Republic of Poland was quoted by the judges hearing Naftali Herts Kon's case. Lesson number 3. Change of paradigm. One of the long-lasting legacies of the communist rule is still this understanding of the law as a sword to punish people for laws infraction. But post-89, the role of the law has changed. We the citizens are looking at the law to protect us against the state. And the judges are still firmly in the law as a sword world. And this case speaks to that. I was trying to claim my constitutional rights, and the judge was looking at me, wow, troublemaker. Lesson number 4. Lesson number 5. Understanding the roles of courts in a democracy. Judges, and I firmly believe that, judges have their own promises to live up to decide cases in accordance with the principles of justice, to defend the weak, to stand up to the government. And in case of Naftali Herts Kon, for 3.5 years, it has never materialized. Why people go to courts today? Why did I go to court in this case? Because I wanted my judge to make sense of the legislation. I want to have a protection against the state. And I finally wanted the judges to not only decide cases in a mechanical fashion, but I wanted the judges to judge my case. And judging is so much more than deciding cases. Lesson number 6. All too often, we can hear that judicial independence means that judges have a right to be independent. That's not true. Judicial independence is first of all an obligation on the power of the judge to be independent and to look at the case through the justice perspective. Lesson number 7. One of the most important, refocusing the perspective. So I was looking as a troublemaker because Polish judges live in this comfortable fairy tale of Montesquieu. The role of the judge is to be la bouche qui prononce les paroles de la loi, which means that the judge is a mouthpiece of the legislature, and that's it. But if you look Montesquieu spoke of the puissance de juger, power of judging. And power of judging is completely different from la bouche qui prononce les paroles de la loi. So la bouche is a very comfortable status quo. Puissance de juger calls for more than just mechanical interpretation. Case of Naftali Herts Kon, Quo Vadis. So my most important lesson from this case, and this is something that I'm trying to teach my students, is that there's no going back to fairy tales of Montesquieu. You have to change your ways. You, the judges, have to change your ways or you will fall into oblivion. When attacked by the majority, that's happening right now in Poland, there was no readiness on the part of the public to defend the courts. Why? Because courts post-89 have been looked at as the source of oppression. Law as a sword reigned supreme, rather than the law as a shield to protect. So judicial ethos reconsidered. One of my mentors and a good colleague, former president of the Israeli Supreme Court, Aharon Barak, wrote those wonderful words in his fantastic book on the role of the judge in a democracy. And he said that judging is slavery. Every time, he said this, every time I sit at trial, I stand on trial. But those two perspectives are completely different. If you sit at trial as a judge, you are talking from the perspective of power. If you stand on trial, your perspective is completely different. That's a perspective of duty, responsibility, and trust we, the citizens, put into courts. So, meet your enfant terrible. I think now you know who the enfant terrible is. And actually, this nickname comes from one of the judges at the seminar I was teaching, because she saw me coming to the talk and she stood up. Oh, finally, we know the enfant terrible of the Polish judicial system. And that's basically very, very, very wrong. Because enfant terrible is a pejorative term. What I'm trying to teach the judges is just do your job. It's not something that I want them, I don't want judges to be revolutionaries. No, go to the very basic ethos of judging. Decide cases with, in accordance with the principles of justice. And finally, let me say a few more personal words. How I have persevered, how I survived silence, letters, stonewalling, director of archives trying to scare me away from the case. Well, I owe all this to my grandmother. So she had this great yes in her in the darkest of times. She taught me how to be kind to people, how to be helping, how to be courageous in times when everybody says no. So I always keep asking myself this question: how would I have behaved in the darkest of times that she had to live through? And to be honest with you, I don't know. But I know that she left me this legacy, that when injustice happens, we cannot turn around. We cannot look the other way. We have to stand up, because she did. And this case, talking in terms of personal experience, led me to formulate my own 5 nevers that I would like to share with you. They're very short. First, never allow the limitations of others to become your own limitations. The moment you allow this, you stop living your own life and start living someone else's. Second, never accept business as usual. And this case is a testament to business as usual. Sometimes you have to stand up and let your voice be heard, regardless of what others say and think. Business as usual robs us of the courage to say no to comfortable routine. Third, never accept the view, no, that can be done. Trust me, I heard this many, many times from colleagues, from law professors, from judges. Kon's case is a testament to this comfortable narrative, live it. That can't be done. As people kept telling me all the time, it can't be done. I reject this philosophy and see it as a convenient excuse for doing nothing. Fourth, never compromise when fundamentals come into play. Sooner or later, those shortcuts will catch up with you. And finally, and most importantly, never look the other way when injustice happens. Speak up. So my grandmother has had her own moment of great yes, and this case was my own tiny moment of my own little yes. Thank you, Ina. Thank you for all your trust in me, and believe me, the right perspective to remember this case and all those 6 years is not what I did for this case, but what this case did for me and how it has challenged me and how it has changed me and how it let me utter my great yes. Thank you. Okay. So I was asked to lead a very small Q&A, and I would love to have 3 questions. That was what I was told. 3 questions. Yes, please.
I wonder why the government archived the writing to begin with. And why didn't they just destroy it? I wonder if we knew why they archived it, we might have some sense of the value it held for them. I don't know whether it was political or whether they recognized some of its literary value.
It's a very valid question. At the stage of silence that I have described to you, when I was calling the archives and I was talking to the people working at the archives over the phone, I have understood that this case is treated by the archivist as a very dangerous precedent, because it was one of the very few cases post-45 that actually archives returned something. So Polish archives, they always take something in, but they never return. And it was actually the words of the director of the archives at the formal ceremony in March 2013. She said this is the very first time that we return something that has been kept in the archives, in our archives. So they were afraid of the potential precedential value for the future. And trust me, there is a precedential value. When I go back to Poland in June this year, I will be taking on a case of very well-known Israeli composer, Ella Baruch Sherif, whose father's diaries have been kept in the archives for the last 50 years. The book has been published on the basis of the diaries. Presidents of Poland, Germany have been involved in the case, and I told her when I met her in Herzliya, listen, forget about the politics. We have to go after them in the courts. So this is exactly the same case that I pleaded in for Ina. The scope is different because the diaries of her father, Baruch Milch, is considered to be the monument of the Holocaust literature. If you go into Polin Museum in Warsaw, at the entrance to the museum, there is a quotation from the diaries of Baruch Milch. So, Mr. Director, if you can hear me, I'm coming after you again. 2 more questions, yes. Maybe to Ina. Two more questions.
You have a license in New York.
We have a question here.
Yeah, in view of present judicial changes in Poland, do you think it would be easier for you now or more difficult to proceed as you did? Because the judge is now being appointed by Ministry of Justice.
You know, it's a very difficult question, and to be honest with you, I don't know what kind of future I will have back in Poland. 3 weeks ago, I have published an op-ed for the Jerusalem Post about the Holocaust Memory Bill. And formally, they might be waiting for me with the handcuffs at the airport in Warsaw in July. So, maybe I'm over-optimistic that I will be pleading another case. Maybe I will be locked up in some remote prisons writing my books from the safety of a cell. So I don't really know. But it's a very valid point because they can react, the judges can react positively, and they can actually, I might not even have to go to court because this new government might see this case that I was talking to you about as a chance to build a good name for the Polish government. Listen, we are returning the diaries of the famous Baruch Milk. So why are you accusing Poles and Polish government of anti-Semitism? But at the same time, it might go the other way. They might be very steadfast in their refusal. And they might look at me, and I could corroborate my reputation as a traitor of Polish nation. Right now, that's my official title back in Poland. One more, yes.
Hi, this question is for Ina. I'm really happy that you're writing a biography of your father, but I'm wondering also what's happening to all the poetry, which is in Yiddish, right? Are there plans to have it translated into English and perhaps publish it?
Yes, it's very much on my mind, and I'm looking. It's very, very, very hard to find a Yiddish translator from Yiddish into English because it requires for the translator to be a poet and also know Yiddish pretty well. So I'm looking. I haven't yet found one, but that's very much in my thoughts. That's the plan.
But there are some translations, right? There are some translations.
No, just few.
Few.
Yeah, just few. Yeah.
So thank you very much for coming tonight. And